Hello and welcome to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. I'm Todd and I'm here today with Percy.
Hello.
And Nick.
Hello, hello, hello.
Today we're going to be talking about violence and tabletop gaming and theater. This discussion is partially inspired by Kids on Bike's fraught combat system, by which we mean to say the intentional lack thereof with the plea to the players not to engage in violence. This led the three of us to the discussion you're about to hear, and ideas we had about how violence is employed in theater and tabletop role-playing games. So to start, what do we mean by violence?
So part of our research for this episode was an article about violence in American theater and how it has evolved by Russell Vandenbroek. And he offers sort of two categories of what violence might mean that he's applying really specifically to the context of like on-stage violence, but I think apply fairly universally. So he talks about direct/behavioral violence, which is like actions intended to harm other people, the infliction of physical injury, the use of harmful or destructive physical force against something. But he also talks about structural and cultural violence, meaning like inequalities built into the social system, aspects of culture that legitimize direct or behavioral violence that doesn't necessarily directly harm another person, but enables harm to be done to them. Yeah. So those are sort of two, I think, useful definitions of what we might mean when we use the word violence.
And within this theatrical mode, we're talking about both like violence that you might see directly, as Vandenbroek describes, like someone hitting someone else, a sword fight, a beheading, someone putting out Lear's eyes, etc., or the structural violence that is done to people, both in ways that like dehumanizes them, ways that lead to like children being without food or drink because of like structural violence being done to people. So like that kind of stuff is sort of what we're looking at.
I also think it's useful to sort of name explicitly what Kids on Bikes means when the creators talk about violence in the game. So I'm just going to read from the handbook, which says, in this game, violence should never be without consequence. Rather than trading blow after blow, stat rolls and applicable skill rolls should determine the outcome of a fight before it starts. Players and the GM should then narrate the outcome. So it's very much not about depleting other people's hit points. It's more so about who gets to narrate the fight, who decides what happens. And it's also really careful to remind players that none of you are immortal, far from it. Compared to the forces you will probably come into contact with, you're exceptionally fragile. A well-aimed bullet from a government agent, the quick flick of a monster's jaws, or a telekinetic character could end things in a moment. So this is a situation in which death is very much on the table. The stakes are extremely, extremely high. And you should not enter a combat situation lightly, which I think is very different from a lot of other tabletop role-playing games that you encounter, where it's sort of violence is, I think, abstracted from the actual physical reality of like doing violence to another person.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like in theater, particularly like Greek and Roman theater or even Elizabethan theater, like there is violence that is shown on stage. I feel like this happens less in more modern contemporary plays, but that's not true of everything. I mean, look at Wolf Crush, which we'll talk about in detail in a couple episodes. Like a very violent show. And there's a question about like why in games or in theater, in entertainment, do we as a species enjoy violence? Like people love their crime procedurals on TV. Like that is a staple. If there is a dead body in the first 5 minutes, people are probably going to watch. And some of the people that we'll be talking about later theorize that this is either due to some like primal bloodlust, which like maybe, I don't know. And some other people theorize it as like a way to explore things that we know are like possible to happen to us without having to actually go through them ourselves. And like, is this why people rubberneck on the highway as they go past a car crash, knowing in their brain that like that could be me and currently is not, and like what that means as humans to experience those things.
Yeah, I think there's a question about like, is violence depicted in media writ large some kind of catharsis, some kind of cathartic experience of like yeah, this could happen to me, but it isn't, or, you know, what might this be like if it were to happen to me? Because I think violence also accompanies a lot of things that we just don't know. Like if you see somebody get killed on stage, that is a way to think about like, oh, what might happen if I were to die, without actually experiencing that. Although that may be a little bit exaggerated, a little bit overblown, but
yeah, I think there's also an element that we shouldn't ignore, the possibility of violence as sort of the simplest and in some ways like cleanest way of doing conflict, or, you know, the kind of idea of agonistic struggle between two sides is at its, or between multiple sides, is at its simplest in a like physical, particularly a like physical direct violence confrontation where, you know, if one person stabs another and then the stabby dies, then it's like very clear who's won that conflict, and we have all of the, you know, satisfaction of like setup and drama and resolution in a very small, simple arc that we all pretty much understand what it was, however else we feel about it.
Yeah, I think that leads interestingly into another sort of facet, which is I think like if you look at the history of, particularly I think in America, but I would also wager in a lot of other places as well, that like violence is sort of at the core of like many moral panics that have happened. Like I think there's like has been since the inception of video games, like a lot of like anxiety about like, is this making our children more violent? Like, what does this mean? What is the effect of like witnessing violence on the people who are consuming it? And that's like a thing that I think is very fraught and complex that we love to panic about culturally. But I think there is, yeah, like a moral element to it as well.
I also think there's because this is an argument that, like, as someone who was born in the late 80s and has been playing video games for most of my life, who has come up against this moral panic a number of times, I also think the conversation is more fraught because, like, when I was starting playing video games, we were talking like 16-bit or 32-bit graphics, where like the remove from reality is very easy and very clear. And now, like, anyone with a certain computer processor can access like very realistic lifelike graphics to go through some things that are similarly violent or not violent, depending on what. And I think like that is an interesting thing in terms of like representation. And maybe there's something in there about how like violence is represented on stage sometimes in like very realistic and very abstracted ways, and the way that people respond to those things, when like the violence and the shock is the point, and when like the implication of violence is the point, and how that feels. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a question of like desensitization that like I think this conversation, yeah, is probably different, was probably a different one to have before like Call of Duty or other such games became so popular and ubiquitous. Because I think like I've noticed this in myself, and I think a lot of other people my age and younger, not that we're that different in age, but
wow, pretty, Percy.
Like, listen, are pretty desensitized to like it doesn't feel like this onerous, scary thing to me in like a visceral sense. Like I think I'm so used to absorbing it in other things that I don't necessarily like it, in some ways it doesn't feel real until it is real.
Yeah.
Which is like weird and like interesting. But yeah, I'm curious to hear more about representing violence on stage specifically and violence in theater.
One of the things about, so like in, as we've said, like in classical theater, violence was depicted differently. Often in Greek and Roman theater, you would have a messenger come on stage and like relay that some violence had taken place, whether that was a battle or an assassination or something like that. Sometimes you might see the actors like appear behind the messenger in tableau to show this like horrifying thing, but like the violence was usually not simulated.
Or if anything, you have the notorious like handkerchief spotted with blood.
Yeah. And then as you move towards more modern times, if you're looking at like the Elizabethan or Jacobean drama, you have active sword fights, you have beheadings, you have people putting other people's eyes out. And then up to the modern day, I mean, even looking back as recently as like Sarah Kane and the in-your-face theater of the late 90s, there was this like hyper violence that you would see in some shows, but I would argue that it has decreased dramatically from what you would see, like the amount of sword fights in a typical Shakespearean drama, for instance, is like much higher than the amount of like violence that you would typically see in a play if you just like grabbed a play out of a hat that was on stage today. And part of me wonders if this is coming from because like our lives are less violent than people who lived in like the 1600s or the 400s. Like, while this was something that I don't think this was in the Vandenbroek, I think this was in a different article I was reading. I'll try to put it in the show notes. But that like, while it is hard to believe, given how much strife there is in the world right now and how like very bad things are still happening, even in Western societies, like blah, 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 that we think of as like, you know, very peaceful, whatever. Like despite state sanctioned violence in America, we are as a species living in like the most peaceful time that we as a species have ever lived in. And I wonder if that is reflected in our drama, just because like violence is both kind of distant for most people. And because we don't all carry swords on ourselves the way that we used to back in the day.
Well, and that's the thing that Sarah Rule sort of identifies as like her reasoning for maybe why we don't see violence portrayed on stage in the same way. She writes in 100 essays I don't have time to write on umbrellas, sword fights, parades and dogs, fire alarms, children, and theater. She writes about how we don't see sword fights on stage anymore and describes this sort of primal bloodlust that we have as audience members, which debatable. But, you know, since we don't carry swords anymore, we don't see sword fights on stage. But since we still want something like a sword fight, and gunfights are pretty boring to look at them on stage, we've instead come to like a verbal tete-a-tete or like an on-stage argument. Although I would argue that that comes less from like gunfights are not satisfying on stage and more about a shift from interest culturally in direct violence from one person to another person and more of an interest in the kind of structural cultural violence that Vandenbroek talks about. Because I think that is the thing that we are more afraid of, as opposed to like somebody throwing down a gauntlet and challenging us to a duel in the street. Although I don't know for sure that was even ever a thing that happened in day-to-day life.
Probably not in day-to-day life. It did happen to some people. I think, I don't know, I do think you're right, Percy, that it is probably in part that violence is such a smaller part of most of our lives, at least certainly most of our lives in the United States, although it is still pervasive in a lot of ways, including in the U.S. But that kind of direct interpersonal violence is thankfully rarer than it was in the 17th century. And that is, Todd, you mentioned that's mentioned in the Vandenbroek article. He's drawing on the work of Steven Pinker, who's a Harvard sociologist, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, but who has published about basically the 21st century being the most peaceful time for human existence on a global scale as a species. But, you know, one of the things I think Rule gets right in that book is that violence can be used to tell a story, and the types of violence that particularly the types of interpersonal violence that exist in our world right now, are usually not as theatrically interesting. Because I think, for instance, about gunfights, like Sarah Rule's right that they aren't very interesting on stage, but that doesn't mean that they're not interesting in any narrative form. You see them all the time in film, and that's because film lends itself to what's really, you know, what we have discovered in gunfights to be narratively interesting, which is, you know, the psychology and and the interiority, which you just can't do in theater because you can't do like the close up on the gunslinger's eyes as he like squints at the person he's going to try to shoot, which is where all the drama in like a classical Western film comes from. Mm-hmm. It's not actually the shooting itself. Usually it's in the psychic conflict.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. She talks about how like the screen has much more handily captured and dramatized the gunfight, but that on stage it's both like hard to, like, if two people pull guns on each other on stage and you hear the gunshot sound effect go off, which is normally going to go through speakers and not be from like a blank that is fired on stage, it is very hard to deduce whomst has pulled first, whether they have hit their mark, whereas like in the theatrical space of a sword fight, like the sound is coming from the clanging of the blades. It's not a sound cue that has been loaded up, and so like it is a much clearer storytelling device for the theater to do something more akin to a sword fight than it is to do something like a gunfight.
Well, like maybe the only theatrical gunfight I think you could argue is interesting is the one at the end of Hamilton. And that's only interesting because there is like a musical's worth of buildup and a lot of scaffolding in terms of song and lighting and all of these other things that are like the gunfight itself is not inherently interesting. You just spent 2 hours investing yourself in what you know is going to happen.
Well, and they do a close up. They literally freeze the gunfight like with the bullet in the air and do a whole soliloquy exploring the victim's psychology while the bullet is flying. Like, they figure it's a good moment, but they just figured out a way to do that thing on stage with the like conventions of musical theater. I do wonder if this also, is partly to do if violence on stage is always, I'm dubious of the idea that it's ever like violence for violence sake, a sort of bloodlust thing, because I think one reason that I wonder, this is speaking from a place of I wonder whether the reduction of violence on stage has to do with the fact that violence is usually not symbolic exactly, but I feel like violence on stage is very often pointing to something else, either a larger system of violence or a different or a larger conflict or something like that. And with the story of violence on stage is, for the most part, also the story of kind of increasingly faithful mimetic violence on stage.
Yeah.
And the more like, just from a technical perspective, I feel like the more accurately the violence gets depicted, the harder it is to use it as a symbol because it feels so much more real. And real violence is very often not symbolic. It is not, which is not, I'm not talking about symbolic violence, which is a different thing. I'm saying, actual violence as experienced by lived people is arbitrary and cruel and devastating, not aesthetic. I guess I'll put it that way. Not a symbol.
Well, and I think there's been like a push in recent years. I think the tide of theater very generally has been moving towards more realistic depictions of things on stage. And it's really, really hard to depict violence realistically on stage because you have to find a way to do it that looks real but doesn't actually hurt anyone. And it's hard to do that. Like it is an entire industry, and like there are very few stage fights that I have seen that looked like they were real, which is fine because I don't want anyone to get hurt. But also, like, if the point of what you're doing is to like show violence that is scary and realistic, that's really difficult to achieve. But I also like thinking back to what the Kids on Bikes handbook says, like a violence against real people is like, like we are a lot more fragile than the Jacobean sword fighters and the Elizabethan sword fighters who are trading lots of blows. Like in a theater environment that is like trying to feel real, there's not a lot of leeway for like cool and elaborate violence, because in reality, like, we as people are like not going to have a long fight before we're done. Like, we have 2 hit points if you want to translate it into those terms. So yeah. So I think too, like, theater that is attempting to be realistic, as opposed to, like, if you have a play that's about, per Todd's example, Vampire Cowboys, at that point, realism's out the window. You could do whatever you want.
That note, it was just about, like, the Vampire Cowboys, Quigwen's theater company that does a lot of very fun, for those who don't know who the Vampire Cowboys are, who might listen to this podcast. They do a lot of very outlandish, over the top, stylized, very much influenced by, like, kung fu movies of the late 80s and 90s, sort of stuff, which I find very fun. And honestly, a Vampire Cowboy show was why I wrote Emily Dickinson Paranormal Investigator, because I said we can get weird on stage and people can buy into it, and that can be fun.
Yeah, like, as we've said on the podcast before, like, I think the American theater is afraid of genre and is afraid of, like, outlandish or unrealistic or fantasy, sci-fi, Western, whatever inspired things, in which, you know, gunfights or sword fights or whatever are welcome, and don't have to conform to whatever our expectations of, like, realistic depictions of things are.
Mm-hmm.
I think another question that this raises for me, that we've sort of been gesturing at, is what is, as Nick said, if violence on stage is pointing at something else as opposed to just being, like, arbitrary everyday, not arbitrary, but, you know, everyday experience of violence. What values does putting violence on stage embody, and how is it sort of serving the play that it's in?
Yeah, I mean, even going back to, like, the roots of the kind of Western dramatic tradition, I feel like violence is often treated as both an instigator of problems and a potential solution to one, sometimes in the same gesture. Actually, I was going to say, in like Agamemnon, going back to ancient Greek theater, we don't see violence. Well, actually, I think there are some good arguments about whether the ancient Greeks actually never, quote unquote, put violence on stage, because there's some evidence that they did in the, like, choral dance movements of the plays. But the sort of grotesque violence, like putting out Gloucester's eyes in King Lear, seems not to have happened. But in Agamemnon, when, spoiler alert, when Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon,
Damn it.
I know, spoiled a 2,500-year-old play. But when Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon, you know, she takes him inside, in behind the skene that is representing his house, and then we hear the murder happen off stage. We hear Agamemnon's cries, but what isn't obvious reading the script is that the way the theater of Dionysus in Athens is set up is that murder, when Agamemnon is led into his house, what would have been immediately obvious to the people watching it at the time is that he is led kind of through the back of the theater towards the place where the sacrificial altar, one of the sacrificial altars on the Acropolis, is located. So Agamemnon gets figured as a sacrifice in this act of violence that is both atonement for the sins that he's already done and launching this cycle of violence that is going to be the entire Oresteia. So yeah, that's I think one way that violence is, we have a very complex relationship to it because we want those clean endings of, like, Agamemnon did a bad thing, he is going to be punished for it. And also there's this recognition that creates these cyclical spirals of violence in a lot of Western literature.
Well, and the Oresteia specifically is pointing toward, like, an eye for an eye makes the world blind. Like, this murder must be revenged with another murder, which must be revenged with another murder, until they're like, we're just going to keep killing each other forever. Maybe we should have, I don't know, a court, is like the kind of I think in our view is a kind of like boring end to this idea of revenge, but like at the time was like, no, this is not how things have been done up until this point, and perhaps we wouldn't keep killing each other if we found a different way to like mitigate violence.
I mean, to a certain extent, I feel like this is the question that we litigate over and over again in the entire, like in the history of, I don't know, I think a lot of the themes of that are embedded in, for example, The Last of Us 2. Like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But the thing that I was actually going to say, aside from bringing into one of Todd's favorite subjects, is that I also think part of this is like not only sort of pointing out systemic violence or structural violence or like arguing that we should stop doing X or Y thing, is that I also think to a certain extent, like, so you see violence on stage intended to implicate the audience, which I think is an interesting use of it. I can't necessarily think of like a very firm and solid good example from a play at this moment in time, but I think very frequently when you see violence on stage, you think about like either the audience is put in the position of like, oh, would you have done something about this? Or, you know, like, I think we are put in a position to like think about how we might be complicit in the systems that are doing this violence, or how we might not intervene in the systems that are doing this violence. At least.
I mean, I would say very clearly like slave play does this with its audience.
Yes, absolutely.
In the Broadway run, the mirrored drops that fly in, particularly when one of the characters is talking about like imagining their ancestors looking on them in this like moment of strife, and these mirrors are illuminated so that we, the audience, are like staring each other in the face around this situation and surround these characters where violence is about to happen, and we know violence is about to happen. Yeah,
that's a great example. Thank you, Todd. But yeah, I think violence functions a lot as a way to sort of point out our complicity, or to sort of invite us to engage in the thing that the play is talking about. So it's sort of a means to some kind of real life political end. And I mean political with like a lowercase p.
Well, and I'm also thinking about, I know, Nick, you were saying earlier that you don't feel like there's a lot of like violence for the sake of violence. And I feel like the violence in like A Blasted by Sarah Kane is this like over the top desensitization to violence in response to the like violent headlines of our world. Like she was writing that in response to the crisis in Bosnia, I believe.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And like that play is harrowing to see or to read. I have done both. And it's just like a lot. And by the time you come out of it, and like trigger warnings, this play is fucked up. But like when you come out of it and a soldier like eating the corpse of a child that was left under some floorboards is like not the worst thing you just saw. That's crazy. Yeah. And I feel like that's part of what Sarah Kane was trying to do, is like there's all of this violence and it just adds up and adds up and adds up. And there's a point where your brain just like shuts off to it. Like there is too much, and what can we do? And some of this is like, and I don't know all of the theories behind the in your face movement and like what they were attempting to achieve. But I think some of it is looking at the ways our world seems very violent and is very violent, and the way that that's just like, if you put a chyron under that and like showed all of those images on the nightly news at 9 p.m., that is an okay thing to do. And if you remove the trappings of a news person from it and show it before 10 o'clock at night on TV, like the FCC will have you off the air.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's wild.
Yeah. Yes. I thought I had a thought and then I didn't. Other than correct. But I think the idea of sort of violence for the sake of violence brings us rather neatly into thinking about violence in tabletop games, because I think our discourse around them is a lot different. The first thing that I think of related to violence for the sake of violence. When you think about violence in tabletop games is like the murder hobo trope, which if you're unfamiliar is like a D&D party of adventurers who goes to every town and like doesn't have a home and just kills everybody there and like takes all their stuff and then goes to the next town and murders everybody there. Like it's this sort of exaggerated, but also like a thing that really happens, you know, stereotype within Dungeons and Dragons, because that is a game where like the ability to do violence is the thing that that everybody is best at, is everybody is best equipped to do. And the game is set up to reward you for doing that to other people because it gives you experience, it gives you magic items, it gives you money. So like, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't that be the way that you play the game?
It's very important to distinguish the murder hobo from the classic expected D&D player who is simply a colonialist.
Right. Well, yeah. Like, in researching for this episode, I read a bunch of different people's frameworks about like why violence in RPGs. And they were talking about both like pen and paper, but also video games and stuff like that have grown from the same tradition. And like some of it is the root of this is wargaming. And so that was like clearly the model. It also sets up like stakes, like there needs to be challenge in games for people to feel that there is something to strive against and to overcome. And like sometimes that could happen in a puzzle game, whether that's like, I don't know, you could play Mahjong, and like Mahjong is a difficult game that you need to overcome. And other times it's like Super Mario, and like there's these weird Goombas and they're going to walk toward you and they're going to hurt you if they touch you. So you either need to avoid them or you need to stop them. And then like in more recent stuff, it's enemies that are attacking you or stopping your way or guards or whatever. And in the case of many tabletop role-playing games, it is just about any non-player character that you could encounter could do violence to you.
Well, and because tabletop games role-playing games situate you as the hero, so by default, anybody who is trying to stop you from doing the thing that you want to do is a villain. And therefore, because villains are bad and they're stopping the hero from achieving their objective, like you have the right almost, I think, to do violence to them, I think is like the situation that it sets up, because I think a lot of role-playing games have this very sort of black and white morality to them. Like you are right and everything that doesn't agree with you is wrong. Thus, it's totally cool. And I think there is like a movement for games that sort of want to like gray that out a little bit more or explore this idea with some more nuance, or in which, like, for example, like this was a big discourse around The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2. Like what happens when you're playing somebody who is like only arguably the protagonist.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting about The Last of Us is telling a story in which the player has very little input into like how the story progresses, which is it's kind of different from how a lot of games are built these days. Like it is a thought that agency and player choice are like integral to storytelling. This actually came up in one of the essays I was reading about Mass Effect, and how the Mass Effect series was like all about player choice. And then at the end of the series, player choice like only affects the color of the way the world blows up in the initial launch. And like all of your choices actually meant nothing. Like the climax was the climax, which was interesting. But with The Last of Us Part 2, I feel like you, the player, are expected to be in a different headspace than the character is almost the whole time, like regardless of which player which character you're playing as. And I think in the moments when Ellie and Abby are put up against one another, that is like such a harrowing experience for you, the player, because you have played as both of these people. You sympathize with both of their plights. And so like neither can be the villain for you, because you have been forced to walk in their shoes to sympathize with them. And so like those, I know for me, those fights were the most harrowing experiences in the whole game, because I knew that I had to proceed. That is what the game wanted me to do. And so I needed to like do violence to a character that I cared deeply for, which was like much more awful than the crazy zombie amalgamation that you find in the basement of the hospital in that game, which was also horrifying, but
very,
like,
not emotionally horrifying, like not emotionally taxing.
Yeah.
I think this sort of gets at an idea that the Vandenbroek article talked about, which is this sort of idea that like we might not be interested in violent entertainment because we have some kind of innate, inherent violent nature or some kind of, as Sarah Rule says, primal bloodlust. But in fact, because like it taps into our ideas of morality and justice, and it invites us to think about those, because I think those are very foundational to the way that all of us interact with the world, and what we understand to be right and what we understand to be wrong. But yeah, I think that observation about The Last of Us also leads us neatly into sort of the question of, in a tabletop game, what the rules are about is what the game is about. So if your game, like Dungeons and Dragons, has mostly rules about how to kill things, your game is about killing things, which is, fine, but that's what it's about. And something like an anecdote that I wanted to share that I thought was funny. I was listening to a game called The Price of Coal, which is about the coal wars in Appalachia, in that one specific place in West Virginia, the name of which I forget. But there's this like large labor conflict, and they were playing a game that is about that on the One Shot podcast. And there is a point where one of the players was like, "Oh, I want to hit that guy." And they did like a whole bit about like, oh, like, roll for initiative, like, do Italians get dark vision as a racial trait, like blah blah blah. But it was a funny moment of like, oh, like, in a game that doesn't have a framework for combat, what happens when you want to do violence to somebody, when it's not explicit in the rules that like how you go about doing that. And it was interesting to me because I realized like, oh, I've like taken for granted that that's like a thing that exists in games because my entry point to tabletop games is Dungeons and Dragons. So I was like, oh shit, like I've this is how I've defined in my brain what a game is. And that's actually, not necessarily it.
Yeah, I think it's I think you're really right, Percy, that it does have our fascination with violence does have something to do with the desire for like justice. I'm totally blanking on the name of this person right now, but I was reading a book by a person named Mickey Kendall recently, titled Spinning Threads of Radical Aliveness, which is exactly as much a mix of things as the title of the book makes it sound. But she was talking about a study in that book that did actually find that many violent crimes have been committed out of some sense, misplaced or not, of injustice. Whether that is, it's a lashing out at what somebody perceives to be an unjust world, or something else. That's the root of a lot of violence. And I always think about early in the Trump presidency, Jessica Price, who's a game designer, wrote on Twitter that the biggest fantasy in Dungeons and Dragons isn't that there are dragons and magic. It's that evil is easy to identify and best confronted with like direct, straightforward action. And I think that is a lot of that's a lot of the fantasy and a lot of the appeal of a game like Dungeons and Dragons, is that like, yeah, we can like know that guy, those guys, those things are bad, and we can just go out and like triumph over them in direct conflict, and that will be okay and uncomplicated.
Yeah. I don't know. There's some...
For the listeners, Todd is making a face.
Several faces. I do think that there's something, because I have a lot of the same, suppositions that Percy had. And like in reading the Kids on Bikes manual, where it was like, we really don't want to build stuff for this because it's like hard and bad. Not that yes, violence is bad, but not that like building a system for figuring out how violence works is like an inherently bad thing.
Yeah.
But that like this shouldn't be your first response. Like, we want to give you other tools to do this, other tools to explore this, other ways to work around these things. And And some of that, I think, comes from like the genre that this is built on, which is very like Goonies and Stranger Things and stuff like that, where like kids are using their wiles and a wrist rocket to like hit a security camera and not like to attack all of the men in black suits.
Yeah, like, and it also feels bad in this specific context to be like, you're most likely playing as like literally a kid.
Yeah.
let's like figure out how we could like,
Here's the rules for shotguns.
Yeah.
yeah, like that doesn't feel great. But also, I'm sorry, carry on.
Well, and I feel like this is the first game that we have played that is like the closest to our times and circumstances. Like Apocalypse World assumes a fraught world. Paranoia is a whole different kind of fraught, but is like a comedic fraught.
But actually pretty close to our lived reality.
Well,
in some ways.
That's another podcast.
But this is why this like Kids on Bikes rules kind of flipped a switch for me to think about like, how is violence being employed in the games that we play, and like what does that say or not say, both about like what the game is trying to do. Like I think the murder hobo quality of Dungeons and Dragons games is like a logical end step for the rules as written. If combat gets you loot, if combat gets you experience, why would you not proceed? And if most of your rules are about how to do combat, why would you not use combat at any time to try to get the things that you need or want? Mm-hmm. Even if that's not the best course of action for your character to make from either like a logistical or even in their own best interests sort of situation. Messing with the captain of the guard in the middle of a large city would normally get you thrown in jail, but because you have plot armor as the hero of your story, and because you are able to do lots of damage and NPCs aren't built to withstand a lot of damage on the fly, like why wouldn't you do those things if you wanted to? And it made me think about like what games are pushing back against that. So not just like, we don't really want to build rules for this in Kids on Bikes, but I know that the Wild Beyond the Witchlight new D&D module sets out to be a module with no combat, which I think is interesting. Like, how do you wargame with no war?
Yeah, there's so much embedded in that.
And I imagine there's other games, like I know that there are other games, but I imagine there's other games where like this isn't even a point of conflict. Like there just isn't war in those games. Or like I've been playing Deltarune lately, which is the sequel. It's the next game by Toby Fox, who created Undertale, which is specifically like a video game that is where no one has to die. It's a role-playing game where no one has to die. Violence is always a choice, but you have to choose it. But there's also like a way around literally every conflict.
Yeah, I will say I find that, gonna give this a little preamble.
Yeah.
I'm a pretty pacifistic person and have been for a long time. At the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that violence actually in and of itself is more neutral than we generally give it credit for, because, you know, violence is also the violence of oppressed against oppressors is also violence, but is ethically different from the inverse. So totally. I do find, you know, I think in terms of theater, that's one reason I think that it is worth putting violence on stage. And in games, I do find that element of choice the more interesting than the games that just say, like, don't do this, or like, we're not giving this any support. One of the most interesting in there is Wanderhome, which is specifically a game that's like, there was a war, but it's done. There's no violence here anymore.
Yeah, and it explicitly says, there's no violence here anymore, period. No questions.
But then what it does is give you a playbook called The Veteran, where the veteran's kind of defining features. It's like, like it's written between the lines, but clearly like you fought in whatever this war was and it kind of fucked you up. And that's like, and you have a sword and your sword must never be drawn again. Describe your sword, define your sword, blah, blah. You have to never touch it again. And then on the list of things you can always do, the last thing you can always do is draw your sword and immediately kill the person in front of you. If you do this, you have to like retire this character and create a new character. You can't play them any longer.
Oh, sure.
So that's like, to me, that's a fascinating and like very clearly political bit of design by Jay Dragon to say there is no violence here, but also violence is always an option.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
It's just going to carry consequences that are going to be enormous, and that you may not be prepared to deal with.
Yeah. So like what I find interesting about Undertale, jumping back to that for a second, is that it's set up like a classical RPG. You get into random encounters with enemies, sometimes bosses, and you can like attack people or defend, or you can act. And act, like the choice to act has different options based on what you're fighting or encountered with. And in Undertale, sometimes that's like flirting with someone, and sometimes it's complimenting their hair, and then you can like choose to spare someone who you have like convinced not to fight, which I think is interesting. Just like as a mechanic, I think it is interesting that like all of these combats can be gotten through with just talking to someone. And Toby Fox, the creator, kind of like this is from a point of view because he's played a lot of games like Dungeons & Dragons or Mass Effect or whatever, where like violence is the only option all the time. And he was wondering, like, are there ways that we can teach nonviolence? Like, are there ways that our games can have nonviolence in them as a viable option that is interesting? And the whole crux of Undertale kind of like throws traditional RPGs on their head. So like if you go through and you don't do any violence in a combat encounter, you don't get any experience, you don't level up. About halfway through the game, you find, or maybe it's at the end of the game, you find that what you thought were experience points are actually execution points, and that your level, LV, is your level of violence. And so like that goes up the more that those things happen. And there's a couple different endings in this game based on like, did you do a lot of violence? Did you do almost no violence? A bunch of like gray areas in between. And Alexandra, I think it's Mueller, who wrote an article called, her thesis was Undertale, Violence and Context. She was interested in like how we could teach pacifism through game design, but noted that like violence must be present in order to be critiqued, which I think is an interesting, like, in Wanderhome, as you're describing it, like there was violence and you could do violence, but like we can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. Like that's not a viable solution to stop violence from happening. And instead, like offering alternatives, I think is an interesting idea for like, how can we go about this differently?
Yeah. And I also think in addition to like explicitly just critiquing violence, there's also like, it also is just valuable to open up your own awareness of like, oh, this is my expectation was that violence would be the solution to this. And what does that mean? And I'm now invited to reflect on whatever that is. Yeah. Whatever that is for me. And also, yeah, like in situations where violence is not the first solution, it also means that when violence does become your only solution for whatever reason, it means that much more. And it is suddenly like, oh, like the stakes are actually stakes and not just like, you know, they mean something. Like this matters in a way that it didn't perhaps before. Sort of the final, like, I guess, question that I would posit is thinking both about violence in theater and violence in tabletop games. This, like, the violence that we encounter happens in the space of our imaginations, whether it be because it is like rendered entirely fictional or because we're seeing, you know, people on stage who are acting and not actually hurting each other. And the thing that I wonder is, you know, are these places that are safer to encounter and perhaps critique violence and the feelings related to it and sort of work through that and understand it better? Yeah, that's my question.
I'll say I think certainly they are. I also, something about the way you just said it triggered something for me that I'm not sure that this is a very unformed thought, but one of the things that Russell Vandenbroek is talking about is basically arguing that at least contemporary, like current American theater is more interested in systemic and cultural violence than interpersonal violence. And I'm suddenly thinking about the ways that earlier we talked about violence on stage implicating the audience, and the shift or the distinction between the ways that violence can be explored on stage and the ways that violence can be explored in a game, because it's the difference usually between watching violence as a witness and participating in violence, fictional violence, but still in a game. You know, games are driven by choice. Or the illusion of choice. And so I just wonder if perhaps that's actually some of that distinction, is that in theater, as a witness, as a spectator, which is what most of us are to violence these days, theater offers a way to critique kind of those social systems, whereas games are naturally going to be much more driven toward exploring interpersonal violence, because so many moments in game are about like you making individual choices, which contribute to systems perhaps, but are not in themselves systems. The way that, you know, theater can kind of present a system and enmesh you in it at the same time.
No, I think there's something there about the division between the spectator and the performer. That in a lot of, and like there is a blurring of those lines, particularly in TTRPGs. But like, how easy is it to disavow violence in combat or like in first person choice versus how easy is it to disavow violence as spectator? Maybe is the thing that I'm thinking about. It is easier to implicate the system than it is to implicate the actor.
Yeah, well, and that's like what Augusto Boal was really getting at, because like the whole point of Theater of the Oppressed, and did he do forum theater? Is that what it's called?
Yes.
No. Yes. The whole point of forum theater and getting the taking the spectator and making them into the spect actor. Like he was literally like it's rehearsal for the revolution. Mime throwing a Molotov cocktail so that when it comes time for you to throw a real Molotov cocktail at a government building, you've done it before and you know what you're doing. You know, like literally that's what he talks about. Like,
and then he got very worried when the farmers were like, "Okay, we have some guns, let's go." And he was like, "Ooh, I don't know."
You know, like I think you're right that there is a distinction between the participatory and just watching something, and I don't know what that means, and that can maybe be what we leave the questioning note that we leave this episode on. But yeah, I think there is something there, and there is like a meaningful difference between doing and watching. I think a thing that I've noticed in a lot of theater in the past few years particularly is like there are efforts and productions that will try and cast the audience in a way that makes them in some way the doer, or, you know, implicates them in a way that puts them in the position of feeling like they've done something, you know. Like a bad example that is lower stakes than what we're talking about is like going to a production of Dance Nation in which you, via whatever is in the lobby, are sort of cast as like a parent of one of these kids. And suddenly you have a stake in it that is different, and you feel like, oh, like I have some responsibility here. Oh, a better example is that I've heard about like productions of Cabaret where you are sort of, as the audience, cast as like an audience of Nazis who are watching the performance. You know, and what does that do to your experience of it if suddenly like you like, oh, like there is a complicity here that I didn't know that I had until just now. Although that's not necessarily the note that I wanted to leave the episode on.
In conclusion, do violence but feel bad about it afterward.
Well,
No, that's not the actual conclusion.
in conclusion,
In conclusion, I think we should be mindful about
Yes.
violence, both in our I think the next time you sit down to play whatever tabletop game you're playing, think about the violence that's in it and what it's saying mechanically and narratively. And I think that's true of the next time you sit down and watch a play. Think about the violence that's here, both the direct violence, the interpersonal violence, and the structural violence. And what are those things trying to say?
hell yeah, Todd.
Hey, I'm the Fonz now.
Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percival Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out cast bios on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.
I'm the Fonz now. Hey.